I think we should start. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Good morning. My name is Tammy Ho Lai-Ming. I am one of the founding editors of CHA, an Asian literary journal, which is the first and currently only Hong Kong-based international Asia-focused online publication, founded in 2007, 10 years after the handover. Today, is the fourth day of Writing Beyond COVID-19, a virtual residency, which is co-organized by CHA and the Mongrel Writers Residence, founded by Susie, who is one of the two writers speaking to us tonight. Susie now is based in New York, is a transnational Indonesian Chinese American writer who splits her time between many selves, cities, and cultures. She is the author of 14 books of fiction and non-fiction, and she is also the editor of 4 anthologies of Hong Kong writing. Susie is currently has also co-founded the International MFA in Vermont, and she previously directed the First Asia's Low Residency MFA. Our second writer tonight is Tim. Tim teaches in an alternative school in Hong Kong. We will ask her about how alternative it is. With a focus on personal experiences in protests, Tim's poems have been published or will be published in CHA, the Offing Sent Journal, among others. She is one of the co-founding editors of THU, which is a creative journal based at Hong Kong Baptist University. Tim translates interviews and news about Hong Kong and speaks to international media. She writes lyrics for bands as well, plays the bass guitar, and she collects tattoos on her body. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. To start, may I invite our writers to talk about how you become a creative writer. Susie, we know you as a long-term writer, but I don't think many of us know about what you did before you decided to be an editor of Hong Kong writing and also a creative writer yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about you before the current you? And does this past self, you said you split between different selves. Does this past self in any way affect your current one? And Tim, you studied English literature at one of the universities in Hong Kong, and you co-founded, initiated THU, the creative journal at Baptist. What inspired you to start your writing journey as a poet? You know, the genre, why do you choose to be a poet? And how do you see yourself as a poet writing in English in Hong Kong, which is dominated by Chinese language writers? Or anything else you would like to add about you as a emerging poet from Hong Kong? Who would like to start first?
Okay. Do you want me to start? I mean, I've told my sort of creation myth, you can call it that. I do have many selves. I was actually part of the Southeast Asian diaspora here in Hong Kong. I was born here, but my parents are both from Central Java, from Indonesia. So they were sort of Huaqiao, Chinese Indonesians. But because their families had lived in Indonesia many generations, my mother, for example, was really, although she looked quite Chinese, although some friends of mine say she doesn't look Chinese at all, she was really more Indonesian, her cultural, you know, because she didn't know how to cook Chinese food when she first came to Hong Kong. And she had to learn here. But ultimately, the best food she cooked was mostly Indonesian and other foreign food. She was a very good cook, my mother. And I speak about her because she was quite influential in shaping one of those selves that was me, you know, because without a slightly foreign culture in Hong Kong of my mother's, I think I would have not become who I am today. My father was raised in a more Chinese household, so he spoke Mandarin. He was completely fluent in Chinese. He went to China to study. Um, and he was in Shanghai in 1949, and then he left before he could finish university because of the, when the communists took over. So this is a big part. I talk about my parents. I've written about them. They were very influential in shaping one of the me's that is this mixed up person. That's why I call my writer's residence the Mongrel Writers Residence. I've always felt like a mongrel everywhere I go. I later became an American when I married my second husband, who was an American, and that changed my nationality, because you cannot hold Indonesian and American citizenship. But I think really, as far as being a writer, I started really young. I was 9 or 10 years old. I started writing stories by myself. It was much more fun than going to school or going out to play. I was quite a quiet kid. I actually, it's funny, the pandemic was like going back to my childhood for me. It was solitude. It was the ability to be able to stay at home all the time and read, not having to go out because you were actually told not to go out. Whereas my mother was very athletic, and she was always like, oh, go out and play. And I was like, I don't want to go out and play. I want to sit at home and read in the air conditioning, which is much cooler than hot Hong Kong in the summer. So that's kind of my background. And I was a literature student in college, and which of course is not the most useful degree to get if you're from Hong Kong, which is why when I came back to Hong Kong, I wound up working in marketing and business. I became a copywriter at first in advertising, and then later I worked in like Cathay Pacific, and then because of Cathay Pacific, I got to travel everywhere, and I thought, hey, I don't want to stay here. I'm just going to go somewhere else and do an MFA. And that was actually part of the impetus. I learned about MFA programs from traveling and meeting people. So, but then, of course, after after I finished my MFA, I stayed in America. I had to get a job, and the choices was to teach freshman writing, which paid nothing, or to get a real job and make a living. So I thought, I'm going to get a real job and make a living. So that's what I did. So that's kind of more or less how it all started. But I've been writing since I was very young. It never stopped. It's never occurred to me to stop writing. To me, it seems like a natural thing to do. And eventually it became a professional thing as well. But, when I was young, I just wrote stories, and sometimes I published them in the South China Morning Post in the children's section. But, you can't really take that very seriously, except that I took it quite seriously because I got paid. They gave you points. They gave you like 5 points or 10 points, and you could trade these points for coupons to buy books. And I thought, well, this is really good. I like this. I'm going to be a writer because I can get coupons to buy books. When you're a kid, you don't think very seriously about everything that happens. So.
Thank you.
Well, speaking of South Morning China Post, actually my first ever published piece of writing was in there. I was always this kind of like quirky kid who would like to show everyone that I was quirky. And then I remember like listening to like tons of strange music from everywhere. And I wrote my first ever music review that was heavily edited by the South China Morning Post when they published it, but they still published it. And I remember like I was in Form 7. I guess I was like 15 or 16, and I was showing it off to all my classmates. I was like, look, this is a very cool piece of writing that I didn't actually write half of it because they really like edited it thoroughly. But this is a piece of writing that I wrote for my favorite band. So my journey of writing, it was like, I was really into Western music since I was since I was very young. And then I thought of like writing something about that to let everybody know what I think. And that kind of sentiment kind of went on until I was in the first year of my university. And then I met Tammy in my first year, like by the end of my first year. She was my professor at a poetry course. And then she just threw us essays on how to think about things and like how actually different cool people can write about such important topics with an economy of words. And then I was obsessed. And then Tammy also told us, like, forced us to write poetry. And we submitted our poetry to a competition as part of our homework, as part of our grades. So I took her advice really seriously, and that's how I completed my first poem, I guess. And then later on, I guess, like, the first moment when I really, really want to consider myself as a, like, serious professional kind of writer, like, creatively speaking, was when Hong Kong started to have this, like, huge, like, massive demonstrations everywhere. It wasn't long ago. It was, I do think that, like, there was a threshold for Hong Kong, like, last year. So I started to, like, I started going to different protests every day. It was very exhausting, but I also made myself write religiously about what I saw every day. And then I sent all my writings everywhere to the world, because I do think that, like, while the Western media is covering Hong Kong, the attention about Hong Kong is always about what they're already thinking about. So the Western media, when they're covering Hong Kong, they're thinking about, like, big concepts like patriarchy. They're thinking about, like, a communist kind of parental power eating up their child. But for me, like, the most moving thing about my home, Hong Kong, isn't anything like that. It's about how, like, people from everywhere coming together to try to do something for each other, to try to save each other from danger. So I want to share that with everybody everywhere. And from that, I sort of figured out, like, what I wanted to do most. I do think that, like, for people to write creatively, they're providing, like, sort of like an alternative way of looking at the same thing. And that personal experience really, really counts, especially when, like, in China or even in Hong Kong, like, everyone is talking about a big thing. And then, but there are some small things that are, like, terribly beautiful that we should all look at. And I think, like, that's the main feel that kind of goes into my writing. And at the same time, like, I don't know, like, before the, like, tonight started, I also kind of, like, brought up, like, how kind of rebellious and how proud I am to myself. So I'm still, like, struggling between, like, the business side of things, the media coverage side of things, and the things that I want to, like, really show the world the most. And I think that tension really keeps me going in terms of, like, for me to be, like, writing or talking about Hong Kong, like, especially during these 2 years. Yeah.
Thank you, Tim Tim. Susie, would you like to read your the beginning of your new piece?
Okay, thank you very much, Tammy. Actually, I have to confess, I'm a substitute reader here because one of the writers, unfortunately, had some emergency, and she's also stuck on an island in the Philippines where the internet connection is pretty bad. So she said, I really don't think I'll be able to do this. So it was too late at that point to commission somebody else. So I thought, well, I was I recently finished a new essay. So this is just the very, very beginning. You know, on July 1st, that morning, I saw a Twitter photograph that was posted by Galileo Cheng. So I want to credit him for this. And he had taken a picture of the police warning on the purple flag, and people in Hong Kong know what I'm talking about. I'll just read what it said because it was something that happened on July 1st. This is a police warning. You are displaying flags or banners, chanting slogans, or conducting yourself with an intent, such as secession or subversion, which may constitute offenses under the HKSAR National Security Law. You may be arrested and prosecuted. So of course, I mean, July 1st was the day that the law came into effect. And I was thinking about that. And, you know, July 1st, of course, has been an important day for us for years now. And I saw a writing prompt which said something about memory and asking us to respond to the idea of what we remember and what we forget. And so I I came up with this piece to speak to this, and it's called When Your City Vanishes. It used to be a day off, July 1st. I would rise early, maybe hit the gym or meet my hiking partner for a walk through the new territories at sunrise. Luxuriate in the empty trains of the MTR and buses that ran on time. By afternoon, it was back to my rooftop room and solitude before crowds thronged the harborside for the annual firework display. Or did I? Who truly recalls normal life accurately in COVID-19 lockdown when days at home seem eternal? This year, normal is a daily conflict for the global subconsciousness, and July 1st has become completely political again. Rousingly, noisily so, blasting global airwaves, as it was back in 1997, the year the day became a public holiday, the year my city returned to China. In case you've forgotten, memory of the news of the world being a slippery slide down chutes of forgotten data, it's Hong Kong, I mean, a city once so lovingly many splendid, a city once as rich with promise as old Jed Clampett's black gold Texas tea. Today, conducting with intent may lead to arrest and prosecution, an intent that's slippery in meaning, secession or subversion, thanks to the new HKSAR national security law that came into effect at midnight of July 1st, 2020. Hey, it's all over the internet. Google it. Even Twitter and Facebook say so. Trust me, this is not fake news. The stream of bounty that was Hong Kong is closing on my vanishing city, not unlike the outdoor spigot that had to be shut off in my northern New York home the morning I awoke to a flooded basement, the year COVID rage. So I'll just stop there. I'll just gloss the Jed Clampett's Black Gold Texas tea for people who don't know the Beverly Hillbillies. This is about a hillbilly family. It was a television series back in the 70s, 60s or 70s. And they struck oil on their property. So they became very rich and they moved to Beverly Hills and bought a big mansion. But of course, they were still hillbillies. And so the series was a comedy, but it was something that I used to like very much when I was a kid, because it was about people who don't fit in their new environment of wealth. So.
Thank you so much.
Can I ask a very ignorant question? Is the flooding real?
Oh, yes. That's why this is an essay. This is based on an actual flooding. Wow. And it made me think about what was going on because, yeah, my basement flooded and it was like about an inch deep of water. I woke up one morning, I was like, oh my God, what happened here? So
does it happen every year or just this year?
No. This is a brand new house. So there should be no flood in there, which is part of the problem. And I equate this construction and some of the problems I have here with things going on in Hong Kong and my memory of Hong Kong. And I do write about one time when I was a child, I woke up one morning during a typhoon. It was Typhoon Dot, and our apartment was completely flooded. There was about, a foot of water. And so this made me recall that time of my childhood.
Thank you. Tim, will you read your poems for us?
Yeah, sure. But before I read mine, I'd really like to respond to what Sushi just read, because she was talking about flooding in New York, and I immediately thought of the flooding in mainland China right now, because the dams are not working really well, and every year they kind of try to make the dam work better, so they're releasing the water, unleashing the water to every village. And then they would give signal to every village, just moments before they unleash the water. So the villages were always kind of half evacuated when that dam leakage kind of happened. And that actually created extra flooding problem this year. And I was also thinking about the flooding in Japan a few like, I guess it was last month. I can't really remember, because like when you're reading news on the internet, like everything goes so fast, you kind of forget like when you sort of read that news. But like the reaction from everywhere was kind of different. Like I remember like seeing some Hong Kongers saying that like they feel more sympathy to what's happening in Japan. Like it's basically the same thing. Like it's flooding basically. People are dying. People are not moving away from their houses, even though like the flood is coming along. But people react differently because of political factors. So like people in Hong Kong are saying that, oh, I feel more sympathy for like the flooding in Japan than the flooding in China. And this sort of tension kind of runs along my writing. I'm like, for me, like I'm like sort of like a diehard Hong Kong fan right now. Like everything that is for the better good of Hong Kong people, I'm kind of like, yes, I'm going for that. But at the same time, I'm also very like aware of like how things, like how choices that we make are actually like based on like political sides that we are on. And then from that, I wrote a poem that is called "The End of Policing." It's not the best poem ever, because it's like too grounded in real life. But before I read, I would like to show you guys some news that inspired my reading. So if you can see my share screen. So I'm going to be reading two poems. The first poem, "The End of Policing," they're kind of inspired by what I read about the police system everywhere. So this picture that you see here, you see three pictures of a strangled man on the ground. This happened 2 weeks before the George Floyd tragedy. So in Hong Kong, like 2 weeks before the George Floyd tragedy, a Southeast Asian man, whose name I don't know because it's not reported on the news, he was carrying drug in Tsim Sha Tsui, and the police thought that he was acting weird. So the police kind of did some arresting action on them, and the guy was choked to death. Like 3 hours after police action, he was dead. And then some Southeast Asian groups in Hong Kong were trying to seek for justice for him. They went to court, they went through a lot of trials and stuff, but still, yeah, our local government is not doing things on that, and they're delaying like information on what actually happened during that incident. So it really shook me, like how like 2 weeks later, George Floyd and other Black people's tragedy like creating such a huge movement in the States now. But in Hong Kong, when activists are trying to fight for this Southeast Asian's rights, even though like after he's dead, and there was no one basically, because everyone else was busy with bigger political ideals, that is to like fight against Beijing, whatever. So that was ignored. And I remember like that weekend when people were fighting for the Southeast Asian drug dealer who was killed by the police. And I remember I was just staying in my room. I felt so exhausted. I couldn't do anything for Hong Kong and for that guy. But like 2 weeks later, like something huge happened in the States. And I thought that like, for me, to be saying this is like, I'm taking things very, very out of historical background, but at the same time, like if we're looking at like people suffering, and yeah, I don't know what we can do. And like, there are other news that really, really inspired me. So this guy, like the president from Philippines. So I remember like a few weeks ago, and then I heard his speech accidentally on the television. So he was announcing his recent COVID measures. So he was like, to the police and the military, and also with the village officials, if there are any troubles from the villages or any occasions that where like the police and the military and the village officials, they feel that their lives are in danger, the army is ready to protect their safety. So the government will not hesitate to shoot any civilians who are disobeying the government's order of like quarantine and lockdown, and the president actually, like with an army, he has the audacity to say that I will not hesitate my soldiers to shoot you, and now if you're detained, I will leave you to get your own food. And I remember being a Hong Konger, I live so far away from Philippines, and I heard about that and I just lost sleep that night. And I was also like linking things like back to Hong Kong, where like government officials are saying things on TV, and when they say things, those things are a matter of life and death. And no matter how angry or how like in grief we are, we don't seem to be able to do anything. And then there are also like so much news like everywhere. This is from El Salvador. So like basically it was COVID, and the prisoners are basically put together in such a proximity for checking despite the virus situation. And for me, like as a tattoo collector, when I saw this, I see all these like beautifully tattooed criminals like crammed together. For me, it's like, this is so aesthetically pleasing, but at the same time, this is so cruel. So I don't really know what to do. And that's what inspired my poem, The End of Policing. I'm showing you guys here, just in case if the internet doesn't connect. So I will start to read. The End of Policing. Thinking of Hong Kong, China, the US, Greece, the Philippines, Kenya, and elsewhere. It's easier to dream of the end of COVID-19 than the end of policing. I can think of the day when the curve is flattened to alarm almost no one, but I can't think of the day when tyrants will not delay data release and omit mistakes. I can think of the day when restaurants will stop pointing thermometers at our foreheads and abandon flimsy boards, stuffed doors for separating tables. But I can't think of the day when my people will not be held at gunpoint, guilty of what we might have never done, a crime unstated on blank documents. I can think of the day when music festivals will resume, thousands of goers sharing hand sanitizers instead of smuggled booze. But I can't think of the day when demonstrations will lead to negotiation, not big bullies' armored national insecurities. Next bit. I can think of the day when schools will open their doors, but I can't think of the day when schools can uninstall barbed wires and classroom cameras for teachers and students to stay open to themselves, to the world. I can think of the day where everyone discovers hand washing, even if the urgency is gone, but I can't think of the day when tyrants will not get more hands dirty, building colored ladders for us to climb, step on each other's scraps. I can think of the day when masks will be seen as small inconvenience instead of a conspiracy and Asian paranoia. But I can't think of a future where protesters could fight for each other without masking our faces from unchecked power, a future where victims of police brutality, beaten, choked, raped, shot, could report their cases without fear, a future where innocent ghosts could be brought back to a life in a changed world they deserved, instead of being cited, slighted, as only a small, unfortunate fraction less valued than tourist revenue. I can think of the day when there is no shame in having a fever, but I can't think of the day when free thinkers and detainees who don't speak the main language will not be spied on, shamed in exile, shackled in asylums until somehow suspiciously suicidal. The end of policing always seems like science fiction to me. Perhaps that's the day when my people will speak in codes, our features interchangeable with 5+1 chafed fingers intact, the other 4 clenched tight, to never expose in daylight fingerprints that remained. Discipline will pass on as reflexes, even in future times of peace. Our lungs would have a higher tolerance for toxins from generations of war weapons, and from smoke, motorcycles would come crashing at holographic fences of the then abolished police outside train stations, a monumental display of the end of cowardice, a tofu drag project doomed to fall over burnt pages and broken bones. So this is the first thing that I wrote during the COVID-19, like when everything is locked down and we're all at home, because I was literally thinking about like all the things that are happening, because there's a police system in Hong Kong. People are being charged for what they're going to say. Even if they're holding a piece of blank paper, they can still be charged. And people are saying that like in the future, when we are going to have like entertainment and stuff, it's going to be different. It's going to turn into something that used to be sexy into something that's like very into like sanitizing and stuff. And I was like, by the end, I was trying to picture like how policing could end, but I know that that's something beyond the literary imagination. But I do think that we need to know that some people sacrifice themselves. So I was putting images, like very, very cyberpunk images of like, this is a protester in Hong Kong. His name is Tong Ying, and he was the first charged under the national security law for like attacking the police, for inciting riots in Hong Kong. And he was the first charged under there. And I remember like after like watching footages of him like crashing his motorcycle with his flag for Hong Kong protest into the police. And I remember like going to school, I was trying to teach my students stuff, but like this image kept popping in my head. It's like, this guy was basically stupid for doing that. Like he was basically sacrificing for something big. But at the same time, it's like something as big as a police state may fall at some point, because yeah, they're a police state because they know that they're not secure. They have to do whatever they can to protect their own self-interest, and that's why they use all these arms and stuff. So like, yeah, so that kind of inspired my first piece of writing. And the second piece of writing that I wrote, so I was like turning to something more hopeful. It was about love stories that I read online during COVID-19. So during COVID-19, you can see like lots of memes and newspaper articles on like how people are trying to find love despite like how we can't really go out there. And this is a picture of like how a guy kind of met a new girl after seeing her dance on rooftop, and he sort of sends a message with a drum machine, and they sort of have this like social distancing version of a dinner date or like a meal date basically. And yeah, that really gave me hope. I do think that like people are doing a lot of stuff to try to stay hopeful and stuff, despite like how much we are entangled in like government stuff and the policing, like systematic oppression, that kind of thing. And then like this inspired my second very, very short poem. But at the same time, I'm not trying to romanticize the whole thing, because I do know that like as a teacher, like after the pandemic, not exactly after the pandemic, but after our first wave, we started school again. And like 2 weeks into our teaching, like some students came to me and they were like, oh my God, my parents are divorcing each other. Like they're really breaking apart like during the pandemic. So I'm very very aware of the two sides of things, like the good side of how people try to find love, and the bad side of how love is a fragile concept, especially reviewed during the pandemic. So I kind of wrote this. This is like, yeah, so a summary of what I learned from my students and the global news. And this is called Love in Isolation. Drones carried love notes across rooftops as cases betrayed cross-border affairs. Holograms sat at the other end of tables. Some households broke their stalemates. Meals candlelit, a live projection on walls, in all the rugged, quiet and loud. Cities mean a quick fix for connection. Some snuggled into a blanket by a full screen of a reclining lover's face on a pillow, surviving the black and blue down bloodlines. The future must be waiting in lone clarity, risking an ideal dose of forgetfulness. Night before face, love couldn't wait to unguard ourselves for fresh air. So yeah, so like policing and how we think about love, especially when everything's locked down and stuff. So like they kind of filled my writing. Yeah, so that's why I'm reading these two tonight.
Thank you very much. I have some questions for Susie and Tim, and then some questions for both of you. Susie, you wrote about in this piece, when your city vanishes, and in it you also talked about the year my city returned to China. In case you have forgotten, it's Hong Kong, I mean. So we have the title, Your City, and in the piece itself, you talked about my city, and also this, you have an elegy for a city. I'm interested to know these different uses of pronouns, and also the elision of this city, Hong Kong, and your relationship with it, exhibited in the different pronouns and words you're using. Can you say a little bit about that? And for Tim, your poem "Love in Isolation," it really depicts the absurdity of life, of the world we live in under COVID-19, which makes certain daily activities very difficult and even impossible. And your poem focuses on the impact of COVID on lovers, the lovers' discourse, the lovers' behaviors. So secret affairs are revealed. Some lovers recreate intimacy with the help of technology. And some lovers rely on imagination to maintain emotional closeness with their loved ones. For this poem, I just want you to say a little bit more about two of the lines. The first one is, you say, cities mean a quick fix for connection. And you also write, surviving the black and blue down bloodlines. I would like to hear a little bit more from you about these two lines.
So should Sushi just
I'll go ahead first. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for raising the question of pronouns. I am obsessed by pronouns at the moment, something that has come about because of a number of reasons, but certainly not the least of which what my city is, our city is, everyone's city is. I have a very complicated relationship with Hong Kong. There's always been a love-hate relationship. because part of me loves Hong Kong. I mean, it's the city that I grew up in. It's the city I have lived in for, at this point, the greater part of my life, I've lived in Hong Kong than where I was actually resident in Hong Kong. I had an address, I had a, than I have in the US. But of course, my other city is New York. And New York was always felt like a place I could just be myself, that nobody cared what my skin color was. Nobody cared that I was only part Chinese. Nobody cared about any of that. Whereas in Hong Kong, it seemed to make a lot of difference when I was growing up. But so there is that complicated experience with Hong Kong. But I think you probably know Soul Mountain by Gao Xingjiang, the Nobel Prize winning novelist. And one of the things I really liked about Soul Mountain is that the pronouns are very slippery in there. It's he, she, they all sort of merge into one, because identity, I think, is quite slippery. And when we talk about possessive, which is really the question in this particular piece, I had originally thought the title of this should be When My City Vanishes. But it's not just my city, because if you think about Sai Sai's famous book, My City, Sai Sai is one of our top Hong Kong writers who writes in Chinese. And I mean, I read My City a long time ago, and she makes her city, Hong Kong, everybody's city. And I think that's what we have to do as writers. So I use the term your city because there's a part of me that wants to speak to the reader and say, this is your city too. If it is my feeling that my city is vanishing, shouldn't you be concerned too? I'm glad that Tim actually spoke about flooding, because of course this is a major issue in China every year, the Yangtze floods, right? And we have the Three Gorges Dam and all the history of that. But of course too, we have been seeing massive floodings in the rest of the world as well, in places that we would once never believe would flood, in the middle of the English countryside, for example, or in the US, we have seen massive floodings of rivers. And even in my area a few years ago, I remember one of the bridges on the North Country where I am had been washed away by a river. And this is entirely due to climate change as well. So all these things that affect us and the things that we remember and try to recall, for me, it's very much tied to water, but it's also tied to this feeling of what is mine is also yours. I'm only a very, very small part. You see, my household flooding is just one tiny little flood that is not really important at all in the much larger disasters of the world. But it's what I really connect to be given city as their city, as our marketing slogan is the world's city. I'd like to think it is, because, so one of the reasons I wrote about 1997 was for that moment in time, that was the world city. Everybody was interested in Hong Kong. We were inundated by, reporters from all over the world. And since 2014, with the Umbrella Revolution, and now again with what's happening in Hong Kong, the world's media is again shining a huge beacon of light on what's happening in Hong Kong. So it's both yours, mine, and ours.
Tim Tim?
Yeah, when I wrote these lines, cities mean a quick fix for connection. I was thinking about like how, I do think that this pandemic is special in the way that like 100 years ago, we also like had thousands like recorded and unrecorded pandemics, but this one could probably be the first one where everyone is connected and everyone sort of gets to know what's happening everywhere. Like for example, I accidentally knew like the medical system in Italy, which I never wanted to. Like I wouldn't think that would be useful in the future, but somehow I knew because of COVID, and I wanted to know what's going on everywhere. to bring some kind of like meaningful learning to my own place. And I like, but like these kind of big topics are always like, to be honest, I don't think these kind of big topics are like in the tapestry of literature, to be honest. Like we can talk about what we feel, but at the same time, there is a limit to literature in terms of like, okay, we feel this, we know that this is happening, but can we claim that we know something, that we know better than everybody else, just because we want to read more, just because we write more? And then I try to go back to like how we look at love and connection, like just people feel lonely, people want to know that they want to be with each other. And I think of like the ways that we connect with each other in terms of dating apps, in terms of even if I go to school and I heard stories about my students' family breaking up, and those sort of things sort of gave me life for some reason. Is like despite every big thing that's going on there, and the influence is kind of like going into like minor levels that are not going to be reported on international media, but at the same time it's actually like really deep in the fabric of life. And I remember like listening to my students, they're like teenagers, and they're like, okay, so last year my family was arguing because there was protest. This year they were arguing because the pandemic is making my parents out of work. And then they told me that like, okay, so now they're out of work, they sort of started to reevaluate their marriage and they're not happy, they want to break up. And for some reason I'm involved in that. When I, like for me as a teacher, as an outsider, when I heard about stories like that, I immediately thought of like how we are like connected, but at the same time, even if we're connected, how much can we do to help each other? I remember like this student, she texted me like at 12, and like, yeah, it was basically 12 in the morning. And then she was like, I'm sad. My parents are like arguing and stuff. And that actually like directly inspired my line, like cities mean a quick fix for connection. Like we are so connected, we know everything, but what else can we do? And then there are actually like so many layers of violence in life. Like no matter like the first poem that I read, like policing, like huge global kind of violence, to like minor violence that are happening in every household. And to be honest, for me, like I'm very fortunate to be in this position where I can just talk about and write about this kind of violence. But at the same time, I would be thinking about like, okay, so if someone told me about that, someone wants my help in that, how far can I go in helping them? That problem is not mine, but I know about that. And they told me because they wanted my help. So like, yeah. And for me, like, this is basically my major question. Like, yeah, during the pandemic, like we know about news from everywhere. So how far can we help? And how effectual our help really is. So yeah, I hope I'm not speaking too much.
Thank you, Tim. Next, I have several questions for both of our readers. And you can choose one or all of them to respond to. I'm interested to know about your way of remembering or deliberately forgetting in your writing, through your writing. Susie, you wrote in your piece, you said July 1st, 1997 remains difficult to forget for many reasons. I think you have in your writing, Tim and Susie, you have different ways of remembering. For Tim is more meticulous cataloging, especially in the poem, The End of Policing. So I want to know about the relationship between remembering or forgetting and in your own writing. And also, when it comes to writing about Hong Kong, what is the defining moment for you? For Susie, it is quite clear that it is 1997, the handover. And what about you, Tim? What is the defining moment for you? And the last question for both of you is about the audience, the readers, the audience members you are envisioning through your writing. I've noticed that Tim Tim's poems have a lot of references to what's happening in Hong Kong, and these references are not necessarily readily recognizable by or understood by readers from another cultures or who are not following Hong Kong politics closely. Whereas Susie, in your piece, I think you have in mind readers who may not instantly recognize some of the references. So I want to know, when you're writing, do you think about your readers, and how much do you expand? Do you invest on your readers' interpretation and understanding of your work?
I'll take that. It's very good. I think these are really great questions, really great points. Yes, 1997 is important to me for many reasons. Partly, I think, because I've written about it in one fashion or another. Pre-99, I have, I've got 5 novels, and they all have something to do with Hong Kong. And one of them was specifically the period right before the handover. Another one was right after that period of the handover. So, I mean, the sort of historical basis of what Hong Kong is has always been fascinating to me, because even as a child, I was quite aware that one day we're going to be China. And I remember that, when I first started writing, I wrote a novel that never got published called Proximity. I was in my 20s, and I wrote about 1997. I wrote about an independence movement. It's all come to happen. At the time, I couldn't get it published. Nobody was interested in Hong Kong. And that's why I'm always curious about the way the media suddenly focuses itself. And for me, remembering and forgetting is sort of historical, both personal history as well as larger history. As far as connecting to the audience, I don't worry too much about that, because I think that I can make references, and if people are really interested, they can look it up, because you can pretty much Google everything today. Every one of these references I use in this particular essay, like, for example, the Jed Clampett and the Beverly Hillbillies. If you just Google that line, Black Gold, Texas Tea, it's from the song, you'll find it right away. And this is the thing that because of course in writing the piece, I had to research and make sure I was remembering everything correctly. So the internet, I have to say, is a great mnemonic. But part of the reason I'm also fascinated by memory was my last book. I did write about my mother's Alzheimer's, because I went back to Hong Kong to live with her. And watching somebody who has Alzheimer's is a very interesting way of coming to understand what memory is like and what it's not. Because towards the end, my mother had no idea who I was, but she was willing to trust me, and I could touch her, and she knew that I was somehow somebody who would take care of her, but she had no idea who I was. She would talk to me as if I was her sister or her mother or somebody else. And it was a very strange and unusual feeling doing that, but it taught me a great deal about what we forget. And I can't say that my mother, for example, deliberately forgot anything, but sometimes among my sisters and brothers and myself, we used to say, oh yeah, she deliberately wants to forget that. That's why she never talks about it anymore. And I think that maybe for ourselves too, I mean, in this piece I wrote, I recalled this flood in our apartment when I was a little girl. And it was such a big defining moment, but I had to research. I had to ask my sister, I had to research news archives to make sure I had the right typhoon. Because at first I thought it was Typhoon Wanda, and it wasn't, it was Typhoon Dot. So I hope that addresses some of the things you asked.
Thank you. Tim Tim?
For me, like, when I wrote the poems, I sort of hyperlinked every piece of news that inspired the images. Because for me, like, these 2 years with Hong Kong's political situation and with the pandemic, they really opened up my vision in terms of how I imagine the world could be structured. And I don't want to forget about all that. But in the process of writing, I do realize that, oh, how could I have this image in my mind, but I forget like the source where like it inspired me. Like, for example, like I met all these like cool, like very like caring first aiders who are from the States. They went all the way from the States to Hong Kong to help with the protests. And then I forgot about them until the day when I saw their pictures taken in Washington, D.C. during the Black Lives Matter movements. And they were like delivered all the way back from D.C. to Hong Kong because like they were wearing all this like protective gear with Bauhinia, Hong Kong's flower, on their helmets. And people were like, oh, this first aider, he went to Hong Kong and then he took what he learned from Hong Kong to Washington, D.C. I'm not trying to sound proud, like people should learn from Hong Kong. Like I'm super opposed to that. But at the same time, like I do think that like one function of people writing and remembering is to know that at some point there's a certain like kind of strange connection, personal connection that would kind of help things to happen in like unexpected parts of the world. And I want to do that in my writing. But at the same time, I know that like if you remember everything that is happening in the world, it's kind of very exhausting. Like, for example, COVID, like if you remember how dangerous it is for the virus to go everywhere, then you wouldn't be able to get close to people. So I also think that like if you want to continue to be a human being, to have your human connection, that at some point you want to forget about things that remind you of dangers, things that will kind of endanger you and people around you. So, but that's also kind of like irresponsible as well, I know, at some point. So yeah, like this is a very great time for people to think about the kind of like responsibility, like, or like how memory could help us as a species, or how memory could kind of isolate us as a species as well. Yeah, so I want to explore these kind of things in my writing as well.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time a little bit, but I would like to know about what you think about life after COVID-19. Tim, you said you're a teacher in an alternative school, and I assume that when the academic year returns, you will be teaching online. How do you see teaching your students in this manner in like more months to come? And Susie, you started the Mongrel Writers Residence, which you couldn't really physically launch because of COVID. How do you see the direction of your residence?
I guess I would just speak first because like last night I was reading this article and letter to the editor, article from Max Sweeney's, one of my favorite satirical websites, and a letter to the editor on The Atlantic. They were saying like how in the States, like teachers are required to go back to school to teach in the fall semester. And then in Hong Kong, suddenly I felt privileged that like Hong Kong government is saying that like you don't have to teach in person, you can just go online all the way. Like for me, like my first reaction is like, okay, this is actually saving me. But second thing is like, but this is from the government. I don't like the government. I want to do the opposite. So for me, it's like, I should be taking advantage of that, to be honest, because Hong Kong is a very stressful place for students. I'm really hoping that like online teaching could liberate the students at some point. They don't have to follow a fixed schedule and stuff. But at the same time, for teachers who really care about teaching, they want to get in touch with students in person. They want to be doing activities. They want to be like knowing them in person to get to know each other. and that may sort of be lost on online teaching if we are talking about like pedagogical implications. But at the same time, like, look, I like reading books, and I spent hours online reading news and memes, so maybe I can manage. So for me, it's like, yeah, I would just see. But I do think that like in long run, that's a good thing for Hong Kong and everywhere, really, because we know how oppressive the education system could be. And maybe online teaching could be a breakthrough of that. If people can be more relaxed. Yeah. So that's
yeah, the Mongrel, sorry, yes.
Yeah.
That's great. I like the idea of a less oppressive education system, as I went through the old-fashioned school certificate and public exams and everything. And this is the reason I fled Hong Kong. Yeah, the Mongrel Writers Residence. I hope I was actually there's another residency near me here in the North Country called Craig Garden, which is a much bigger one than mine and has been around for many years. And we had talked about collaboration already, and so hopefully I will be able to continue to do these kinds of virtual things for a while, because there's no saying when I can really realistically accept applicants or consider trying to sponsor people to come to this residence until we're sure that things are open and safer. New York State actually right now prohibits people from a lot of other states, and of course Americans aren't welcome anywhere anyway right now in the rest of the world. So it's a difficult thing to project to, but I think for me it's this virtual life that we're all living right now isn't the worst thing for reflection. And just in closing, I wanted to share this thought for Hong Kong, because a big part of Mongrel Writers Residence is to connect with writers from Asia, including Hong Kong, of course. I had a book that came out in 2018, which was a collection of short stories called Insignificance, and they're all about Hong Kong. And in one of them, which was titled Off the Record, it's about a journalist and a diplomat. I used as an epigraph the words of Chairman Mao. I find Mao very interesting to go back to these days. And I just wanted to read these two lines. It's from the speech at the first plenum of the CCP, and this was on April 28, 1969. And I see in it, interestingly, a message for Hong Kong. There are still things in this revolution which have not been completed and must still be continued. For example, struggle, criticism, transformation. After a few years, maybe we shall have to carry out another. So I'm hoping the Mongrel Writers Residence can embody some of this ethos.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Shusi, for reading tonight and today, and also thank you everyone who is here with us. Have a lovely evening. Have a lovely day. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Come back tomorrow.
Yes,
we have more.
Tomorrow at 8 Hong Kong time, we have another event featuring Chris from Hong Kong and Paul. And Paul is here tonight with us.
From Singapore, yeah.
From Singapore, we hope to see many of you tomorrow night as well.
Okay.